Dobro, mi veseli, da sem lahko tukaj pri vas kot tujec, tako da bom jaz danes veliko povedal, kaj imam za povedati, ker tudi še vedno bolj slabo govorim slovensko, tako da zame je to ful lažje in mislim, da je tudi zaželjen. Okay, so I switch to English. My name is Jonas Sonnenschein. I'm originally from Germany, lived and worked for a longer time in Sweden. Now for several years my home is Slovenia. Before I start the presentation, maybe I'll just tell a couple of things about myself so you know what kind of questions you can send me after this camp. So if you have questions or you want to get in touch, that's why I'm talking a little bit about my background. I'm an economist, environmental economist, have never studied pure economics, always interdisciplinary, once with philosophy, then later with environmental management and environmental policy. I'm regularly teaching at Lund University in Sweden, where I don't talk very much about communication, but more about environmental economics, how to value the environmental changes that we see, how to value CO2 emissions in monetary terms, and so on, but also how to design better policies. I have then later, in the second part of my PhD studies, also focused on behavioral economics, where the idea is that we are actually not the rational decision makers that neoclassical economics wants us to be, but in effect we systematically deviate from that. And if once we know how we actually make decisions, we can use that for better policy design. So this is one of my other research areas. Okay, work-wise, I'm now working with Humanotera, the Slovenian Foundation for Sustainable Development. We are one of the oldest or older environmental NGOs here in Slovenia. I'm working with also the Care for Climate project with climate change awareness and also some advocacy work. I also once had my own small NGO called Green to Be, where I traveled with a friend around the world and we gave workshops in sustainable consumption and production in high schools, companies, and so on. Every once in a while I also take small policy consulting projects. Yes, that's about me in a nutshell. Now, because it's afternoon, it's the last session, I thought we start maybe this small exercise here with a bit of an experiment. And now I take one role as a presenter. Welcome on the hot side of the Alps, Slovenia, end of the century. To start with, I want to show you just for a couple of seconds or 1 minute the beauty of our planet, if it's actually playing. Yes, it should play.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright, blessed days, dark, sacred night. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Okay. Probably all agree we live on a wonderful planet, right? Especially here in Slovenia, much of the beauties of nature we can actually see very close by. However, we live on a planet that is also challenged. This is the first picture of our planet from space, from 1971, from Apollo, where we could first time really see with our eyes how vulnerable the planet is in the big area of space and how small the atmosphere is. Today, we have an average land temperature of a little bit less than 15 degrees, which makes life on this planet very nice. However, without the greenhouse effect, it would be minus 18. And I'm sure you have maybe heard that yesterday or today already. Why am I telling that? Well, because we need this sweet spot between too cold and too warm. On Mars, there's almost no greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, a completely frozen surface. Venus is a hot planet, fits the name maybe, where the surface temperature is more than 400 degrees. Also due to way much more greenhouse gases than we have here on the Earth. Now, since the early 70s, when we actually found out about climate change, even the big oil companies, as we learned last week, all knew about climate change already in 71. There was a new report about Total, the French company. They all knew perfectly well how it works. So that's 50 years ago. Since then, emissions have tripled. Currently, they are at an all-time high. This graph shows the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere going up. I'm sure you have seen that also in the last 2 days. This graph. Now, why do we bother? Triglav Glacier, gone. If we look forward, or if we see at other things that are happening, we have more diseases, we have deforestation, we have droughts, floods, permafrost is melting, we have green winters, we have floods at the seaside because sea levels are rising, and so on. If we look into the future, so these are pictures, montage, what could happen by the end of the century if the worst case scenario comes true. Pohorje, still possible to ski there with snow cannons. End of the century, in the worst case scenario, no way that there can be still skiing. Lipica, lush green meadows, the famous horses are grazing there. By the end of the century, in the worst case scenario, not much more than a desert will be left. And we could go on, Tartini Square. Now already it's flooding much more often than it used to happen in the past. If worst case scenarios come true, there's sea level rise and more strong winds and storms, which eventually will make the city without further measures to adapt not habitable any longer. Okay. Trees make up a very big part of the country. It's one of the most forested countries in the world. By the end of the century, if we don't take measures, trees cannot run away, right? So if the trees are in the wrong place and it's getting too warm, too dry, and they cannot adapt quickly enough, it's just the wrong species, they cannot move. We can move somewhere else. Trees will maybe then be affected much more by storms, by lubada, by the bark beetle, and so on. Impacts on us, maybe challenges with food security. Floods, I already mentioned. Diseases, mass migration. We are doomed.
Yay.
Okay? First part of the experiment. Now we shift back a little bit. I want to take another role here in presenting. Doomsday is not fun, right? So let's see. I have to dress up again more serious. Not extremely serious though. But yes. Okay, welcome to my short presentation about climate change in Slovenia. I will introduce you to some scenarios and their implications until the end of the century. Probably you also have seen these kind of graphs the last week. Okay, the latest IPCC report, Assessment Report 6, in Working Group 1's findings shows us very clearly climate change is happening. It's us, it's not human factors. Human factors don't lead to additional warming. And it's quite serious. We have already experienced 1.2 degrees of warming in Slovenia, roughly 2 degrees of warming since pre-industrial times. There are different scenarios for its future development. Have you seen that as well? These are emission scenarios. The worst case scenario is the upper one, but we, of course, with the Paris Agreement, want to work on some of these scenarios to bring down emissions and then keep global warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees until the end of this century. Different scenarios are associated with very different temperature developments, which then cause different impacts on our natural systems. This is the temperature development in the worst case scenarios in winter and in different time periods: winter, summer, spring, and autumn. The same happens for precipitation, so rainfall and snowfall. Even in the most ambitious scenario, the worst impacts of climate change can still be avoided. Now, how much time do we have left? How much emissions do we have left? Well, scientists have calculated to keep global warming within 2 degrees of Celsius, have a 2/3 chance. We roughly have 1,000 gigatons of emissions, CO2 emissions left, carbon emissions. That means at 40 tons per year. Currently, this means roughly 25 years. This is very challenging. If we look at Slovenia, we have 30 years left to bring emissions down to net zero. For this, we need clearly additional measures. Institute leader Stefan has shown that with the current existing measures, we keep emissions roughly stable, but what we want is to get down to net zero. Yes, we can get there. We can get there if we have ambitious policies. In the NEPEN, the National Energy and Climate Plan, it is quite clearly outlined for different sectors how we can get down close to zero and how we increase the natural sinks, the forests, so that we end up at net zero. Conclusions? Well, climate change is indeed caused by humans and it's accelerating. By quickly and comprehensively reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the worst impacts can still be avoided. Political targets, strategies, and action plans are in place. Now, let's get together and work on the implementation. Okay, this was my short experiment in the beginning. What are your reactions to the two kind of different presentations on roughly the same topic? Now I put on the check. Any immediate reactions? Yes?
The second one is very abstract.
It's very abstract,
Yeah.
yes. Okay, I was also hurrying up a little bit, not going through it step by step, but yeah, I agree.
You cannot imagine.
Ja, by the way, vi lahko tudi po slovensko mene vprašate, pa nekaj poveste, če ga boš kaj razumem dost. Other reactions?
The first one is playing more with the emotions.
Yeah.
Druga je bila malo bolj optimistična.
Yeah.
Malo več akcije.
Less is almost impossible, less optimistic. Yeah, I mean, my main idea here was really to show different aspects that I will refer to now in my presentation and in the short workshop later on. And we'll get back to that probably throughout the whole presentation. This should not appear once by once. Why do we communicate? This is the first aspect that I want to cover here. Why do we communicate about the climate? Because in the end, what we want to achieve is changing environmental behavior. There are tons of theories about psychological theories of how you can actually impact behavior. I won't go through them. If you're very interested, I have lots of references that I can send to you, but I think the main strategies are usually working either on knowledge or awareness, and some on motivation. So we communicate to either increase the knowledge of people about climate change or their awareness, their feeling that something also has to happen. This shapes then the attitude. And once we have changed our attitude towards the problem, not seeing it as maybe something abstract happening elsewhere, not affecting us, but seeing that we have to change as an individual or change as a part of the society, then this might actually influence behavior. So these are all kind of black boxes in my talk now. I will mainly focus on communication with the purpose of changing environmental behavior. Okay, so just that we have this purpose back in our heads. So communication is not a purpose by itself, but we want to solve the challenges that we are facing. Because in communication you can do lots of things, and sometimes we also get carried away. Can I use the presenter mode here? Probably. Now, when I was preparing for this talk, I thought, you're all students, you probably all need some sort of framework, some conceptual framework, something to conceptualize how to communicate with a how-to toolbox or something. And the more I looked into that, the more frustrated I got, but then I found this quote. The other people have reviewed actually this whole field of climate communication and came to the conclusion that the field of climate change communication is characterized by diverging and incompatible understandings of communication as a theoretical construct. In some instances, communication theory appears reduced to an ad hoc toolbox from which theories are randomly picked to provide studies with a fitting framework. It's not what I was after, but it's probably reflecting very well my experience when I was looking for the one theory to rule them all, which I unfortunately didn't find. So then I got back to what I actually learned myself at some point about communication and went back to the super simple model of communication, the sender-receiver model. All of you have probably at some point in high school or university heard about it. Communication, we have a sender that sends a message and the receiver. This is super simplistic and I'm very sorry for that. And this is not the truth because it's not a one-way flow. Very often you get feedback. I all the time look at you and you're nodding at me or you're shaking your head or you're smiling. So also the receiver, when receiving the message, actually gives feedback to the sender and also maybe influences the way the sender sends his message or her message. What was very important for me is that the message is always framed through a medium. So we need some sort of text or visuals or whatever kind of message. Plus the context. I think here, especially when we're talking about important social challenges like climate change and environmental challenges, then the context plays a big role. This will be used now to actually frame a little bit of the input I want to give, but before I start, I would like to ask you to maybe with your neighbor or 2-3 together, have a short discussion. And think about one of this weekend's lectures or workshops. What were the main messages? What was the medium and the context? Were the messages influenced by the sender? Were they appropriate for you, the receiver? Maybe just take 5 minutes, just turn to your neighbor. If the lectures, I wasn't here, if the lectures don't suit, you can also think about another communication event. But I thought this is something you all can connect to because you met here, some of you probably for the first time. Get some feedback. The easiest is probably the context, right? So what we're discussing was the context of the communication that took place so far in this camp. Context is probably education in one way or the other. Would you all agree to that?
Awareness.
Awareness, okay, yes.
Communication. Yeah.
Yes. And maybe I have a couple of questions here, but if there are certain aspects you as in the groups want to highlight, is there anything you think is of your discussion that is interesting sharing with the whole group? I'm sure there is.
The main message, we need to do something.
Okay, the main message, and that was clear in all the lectures to the same extent, or
No.
was it highlighted? It went up and down. Okay.
Like always.
Probably you had some presentations that were more focused on scientific aspects. And here also the sender was a scientist probably. And I saw now you had a session that was more focused on practical aspects. And the sender or the communicator here was also somebody more coming from the practical side of tackling this challenge. I'm not speculating, but
But you are close to it. You are close.
Okay. Now, were the messages, this is probably for the evaluation afterwards, but do you think the messages were appropriate for you as the receiver of the communication? Sometimes
Well,
yes,
it
sometimes
depends.
no.
It depends for who. We are not
Yeah,
all the
exactly.
same.
Because you probably all have different backgrounds, right? Yeah. So we see that it's sometimes very tricky to actually communicate because your audience might not be homogeneous, like in this case. Then you have different sources, and you can actually frame also the messages in very many different ways. What were the media that were used?
PowerPoint.
PowerPoint.
Mask to mask.
That's my PowerPoint. Okay. Other media?
Yeah, mask to mask.
Face to face, yes. Mask to mask.
Videos and simulations.
Sorry?
Videos, YouTube videos.
Video, pictures,
Yeah.
actually practical experiences. Sorry?
Writing.
Writing? Yeah.
Observation on the outside of the classroom. In the park.
Okay, so
Fieldwork.
Yeah.
nature, not nature experience, but yeah,
It was also questionnaires you
yeah.
thesis.
So you see it also in the choice of media. There's a super wide variety, even within such a very narrow framework like this camp. Now we talk about climate communication on much larger scale. So also excuse me if I'm very often only scratching the surface and maybe just highlighting some challenges rather than solving things for you. I would like to talk a little bit more about the persons that are involved in this communication, and especially in the receiver of our communication. I said before, we want to get to behavioral change in one way or the other. There doesn't need to be individuals changing their behavior, their everyday behavior, but that could also be behavioral change of decision makers, of people working with us. And for a long time we had this discussion within our organization when we do advocacy work and awareness raising. How much should we stress the responsibility of the individual? How much should we look at systemic solutions? And now I came across a fantastic paper, and I share that with you in the references, that actually identifies 5 roles for us in this climate challenge, in this climate crisis. Yes, we are consumers, right? We are consuming, we are using transport, we're driving our car, we're using electricity, we're consuming food. No, to see us. But you don't look too much at the screen. I want attention. Now I lost my breath. Consumers. And very often, and I think too often, when we talk about behavioral change, we talk about the consumer. And that's why much of our communication is also addressing individuals as consumers. But we're much more than being consumers, right? So one more aspect, which is very closely related to being a consumer, is being an investor. In a way, we also make decisions where we put our money. This paper is about high-level people who can be kind of influencers in this whole climate debate, so maybe they have much more opportunities to actually invest than we in this room have, but maybe at some point in your life you also have to make choices where to put your money. Because it's not the most relevant, I will skip that for a second. What we've also very often highlighted is that we're all citizens. And as citizens we have the right to vote and the right to be voted, so we can be politically active. This is also behavioral change in the context of the climate crisis. It's not only consuming, we are much more than that. Also quite important, and I have to admit that we have not thought about that so much also in our work at Humanotera, that we are always part of organizations. You're part of a university, for example. I'm part of my workspace, of our group at Humanotera. I have before been teaching staff at a university. I could work at a factory, I could work at a municipality, I could work at a ministry, and so on. So we are organizational participants. We participate in organizations, and also there we have quite some power. And again, this is kind of a different communication that we have to address to that role. finally, everyday life, we're also kind of role models. We communicate through our actions. So I think this is maybe one aspect that could be also cross-cutting, right? You can be a role model in your organization as a consumer, in your day-to-day interactions and so on. Here, I think it's more meant as a role model in your social life outside organization, outside consumption activities. Now it looks good. This is the paper, it's very fresh, it just came out end of September, and it's a very good read. Actually, this is one colleague of mine from Lund University in Sweden. We worked a bit together. This is complex and I don't want to go through it. The roles that we talked about before are in the middle. Here are resources, so disregard the left and the right, but I think the resources we have are also very important when we think about how we can use communication. So what is our informal social influence? No? What is our social network? How can we activate that in our communication? What is our formal influence at the workplace and so on? Now we're back to being maybe an organizational participant. Where communication plays a role in the avenues of influence. So here it talks about how we can then, in these different roles, make a change, make a difference. In the policy-making process, in lobbying, social movements, once we are shifting social norms, and not social norms, norms in the organization. What could there be norms in the organization? There could be, for example, a travel policy that doesn't allow employees to use an airplane if within 5 hours of travel time or 6 hours of travel time you could reach the destination with other modes of transport. We had that at Lund University, we have it at Untitled. These are kind of the type of things you can leverage also within the organization. So just to show you a couple of examples that you actually have different avenues of influence. You cannot, it's not just spending money on some services or products. This is an avenue of influence that is very straightforward and that is very much present in the debate. But there are so many more avenues you can actually influence what is happening on this planet. Okay, if we go back to the receiver, I've talked about this kind of climate communication more often in the context of high school education and with some teachers. And then I often use this quote. There's a huge gap between young people's view of problems such as climate change, which is often quite bleak and pessimistic, and their view of their personal future, which is often quite optimistic. Thus, climate change is perceived as distant and separate from their own lives. This makes it important to explore how young people can engage with this problem in a personally relevant way. Okay, very abstract quote. I tried to make a graph from it. If we look at our personal futures and think, what will our future be? I mean, I see myself going out skiing, which I learned in Slovenia, so I'm not a good skier, meeting friends, spending time with my family, and having a nice work life. And of course, I'm optimistic about that. Why shouldn't I? When I think about the future of the natural environment that actually supports all of us, so I try to avoid talking about the planet. The planet will be there without us, no problem. But the natural environment, how we know it and appreciate it, might not be there. This is often then kind of disconnected from my future activities. What we have to achieve then is to realize and make people realize that the future depends on the state of our natural environment. Okay, I think this is really a thin line here of not making young people despair and feeling hopeless, but at the same time engaging them in the topic. Okay, so I think there's more and more evidence now about climate anxiety and hopelessness. This is not what I mean with that, but still find topics, find messages in the communication that connect the two worlds, my private world and the environmental problem. So there was one teacher that asked me, can you do something about sports? There was a school of telecommunication, and there were only boys. And they were only about sport, all about sport. So then I came up with this kind of small excursion on climate change and winter sports. Actually, my father-in-law happened to be an Olympic skier, 72 in Sapporo, long time ago. And he told me several times how he was in summer skiing under Prisluhnite, whatever.
Yes.
There was some sort of glacier, so there were actually summer competitions. There were even small lifts up there. And that probably is the time when he was actually practicing there in '64. Now, then I thought back about my own daughter who went to kindergarten here, and they always go with the kindergarten to Vršić for a spring camp. So I was there twice in May to pick her up in exactly the same location, and it looks very different. In May, this is not July, August, there is no snow.
But in August there is snow.
Thank you. So like this, I could kind of try to connect my personal stories, make it a bit closer to their own lives, bring in my experience to their own joy of skiing, and then maybe add a couple of more heavyweight statistics, which shows how many days of snow cover will there be in different regions of Slovenia, and how that will change until the end of the century. And you see, especially in this region in the northwest, where there are actually still days with snow cover, is 70 to 100 days less by the end of the century in the worst case scenario. And this is quite a strong message. It basically means in lower lying skiing areas, no way there's any chance that you can still go skiing by the end of the century. So this was one of my attempts to kind of connect and shape a message, and choose also maybe the medium in a way that it connects to their lives, everyday life, and their expectations for the future, which are quite optimistic also maybe when it comes to skiing. Another aspect in this kind of understanding the receiver, so I'm still in this part where I want to better understand who is the receiver of my communication, is the value-action gap. If you look at all the surveys in Europe, you can see that knowledge about climate change in principle is very high, even increasing. You can see that environmental values are increasing. So there are maybe self-interested values, there are social values, but there are also environmental values. So how important do you think this is? Especially on the young people, they give very high weight to environmental issues, but then very often this value-action gap is discussed. These are actually two of my pictures. When I had this small NGO traveling around the world, we also gave workshops on the Roskilde Festival in Denmark, which tried to go green. I think it's actually one of the large festivals that is quite sustainable. Still, if you go to the camping area, that's what it looks like. So here you probably could make a poll, and people that we asked actually signed all our messages, said, yes, you're right, we have to do something, but then the actual reality looks quite different. I think this is also important to keep in mind, to maybe also in the communication try to hold the receiver in a way accountable. Are you sure? Is it just cheap talk? Or are you actually sure about what you state is your value? How far are you willing to go? Okay. This was a very short wrap-up of the receiver. I think also as a sender, we're sometimes in the different roles, not just as the receiver. Are there questions? Or are there aspects that we would like to discuss? Are there questions? Always a stupid question. But is any of these things... Okay, then I will just keep on going for a second. Messages. There are a couple of issues when shaping the messages that I just want to highlight from my practical experiences. Much of this is not really rooted in academic research, sorry, but maybe it's still one or the other thing is valid nevertheless. What we experience very often when there is communication in the context of climate change, that many other issues are thrown into the same kind of debate. As if climate change is also about the ozone hole, about plastic pollution, about biodiversity loss and everything else. Some of these things are clearly interrelated, but they are not at the core of the debate. I will get back to that. Then, not every message has the same weight. I think we can clearly prioritize drivers of climate change, impacts and solutions and so on. And I will also get back to that. And I think very important, we always try to not raise issues or problems without then offering solutions, because the kind of presentation I gave in the very beginning does not empower anybody to be a change maker. It leaves you in despair. We are doomed is not the best take-home message in the end. And KISS, keep it simple, stupid, or keep it short and simple. Sometimes it's also like that. Yes, this is something I have to tell myself much more often, especially as a German, you tend to write half pages, one sentence. But you should again think about the receiver. I think also when you do academic writing about climate change, and this was a really big eureka moment for myself when I learned about that in popular science writing, in academic writing in Sweden. They said we have different traditions. And I suppose that Slovenia is in the German tradition of science writing. And that tradition says, well, the reader is responsible for understanding my thoughts. Okay? You write a text, you want to be precise, but you put the responsibility for understanding on the reader. While in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, now I'm polarizing, it's not that clear-cut, but it's much more, I have the responsibility to write my text in a way that everybody can understand it, or that at least my audience can understand it. So the responsibility for understanding is with the sender, not with the receiver. And I think this is sometimes good to reflect on when you write text yourself. Is this something that only I understand, or is it something that actually my target group can understand? So, and for that reason, keep it simple. But I said I come back to the first 2 points here. What climate change is not about. And I will show you some statistics in a second. Waste is the waste sector has a very small fraction of all the greenhouse gas emissions. And it's important and we have to work on it. If we say recycling is the most important aspect to tackle climate change, that's wrong. First of all, when we talk with individuals, we talk about waste separation. It's not recycling. We separate, and then what happens afterwards is out of our hands, right? So it's separation, but not recycling. This is very important to me because also last week I gave a short interview in a TV show, and then suddenly it was about climate change. They had a predstavitvi in between, and it was about plastic pollution. So this plastic issue is haunting me. Ozone layer, ozone hole, same thing. This is about how much UV radiation is coming on us, and it's also a challenge, but it's not clearly and strongly related to climate change. There are so many more environmental challenges. Weather, okay, that is quite clear, and I think you know about that much better than I do. Weather is something different than climate, and probably it became clear in the first part of the camp. So, focus on climate change and climate change drivers and climate change impact and climate change solutions when that is your topic. Don't divert to other issues too quickly. Yes?
Is circular economy solution for climate change?
It's not the solution, but it's part of it, of course.
Quite important. Do you think so?
It probably depends on whether we're talking about the concept circular economy, which I think is very important for or what is actually done under the headline circular economy. Because I think very often things are labeled circular economy, which are actually waste management. I think that we're actually working on on circular economy solutions, which means designing products in a completely different way. Being maximum efficient to not waste anything, then closing the loops completely. This is something quite different from what is done under the headline of circular economy. So if we do all of that, what is actually within the concept of circular economy, yes. But I think it's sometimes misused as a buzzword like green economy, sustainable development, and so on. This is my short answer to that. Yes, plastic. Do something drastic, cut the plastic. There was a slogan, you remember this Suez Canal issue? Climate change, and the small bugger and it says banning plastic straws. Right? So, yes, we should cut plastic consumption. We should cut plastic pollution by all means, but not because of climate change. Okay? It is because we're polluting the oceans, the rivers, and so on. I looked quite a bit also now in the context of our Care for Climate project and before in my research on what kind of behavioral change we should campaign for. And if we're campaigning for simple, painless behavioral change measures, there is a risk that it backfires. Why? So the theory goes here. If we highlight, please don't use plastic straws. Bring your own bag to the shop. Don't take plastic bags from the shop. Separate your waste. These are things that you do very, very often. And almost every day we go to the shop, we separate waste. If we do that very consciously and we see the campaign, yes, this is what we should do, then we suddenly think about ourselves as green consumers. I have some relatives that have 2 cars, fly on holiday several times, live with 2 people in a big house with a big lot, have to heat that house, and think of themselves as a green consumer, absolutely green and sustainable. And I had many discussions with them about that. And they're telling me, yeah, but even when I separate the waste, I take out this small plastic window from the envelopes, the paper envelopes, so that I can put the plastic in the plastic and the paper in the paper. These are the kind of actions I'm thinking about here. Right? People do that very consciously, but forget that maybe flying overseas to New York for shopping and back or whatever, for whatever reason, causes CO2 emissions that are higher than the amount of CO2 caused by plastic straws that you could consume in hundreds and hundreds of years. So just to that it's irrelevant for climate change. It's relevant for other issues, okay? And many small changes can make a big difference. Many small changes make a small difference, if that doesn't include the big actions that are actually needed to bring down emissions. So what I want to highlight is in the messaging, we should really prioritize. We should focus on what really matters, because otherwise there is a risk if we focus on small things, we kind of create this backfire situation. Is that you can challenge me on this. I had many discussions also in the context of the project, because of course there are also other theories. We start with the small changes to then get people aware, think about the issues, and then once they're aware, they're into it, we can move on to the next step. Right? Just to get them hooked, get them thinking about it, and then move on to the next step. I think very often this next step is missing. Because it's the uncomfortable issues you have to talk about then. Please challenge me. This is I think it's a bit of a complex graph, but it's very, very good. It says, it is a cross-cutting study, I think in 20 or 25 countries around the world, and it shows the percentage of people who believe that among the most effective actions to tackle climate change are, and again we are here, recycling as much as possible is the number one. More than, the median is somewhere at 60% of people who think this is among the most effective actions. While if you look at CO2 emissions per year saved, it's among the smallest things you can do. There are other issues, like changing light bulbs, very effective. No, it's very small. But then there are things like not having a car, eating a plant-based diet. Okay, let's skip the having one less child because we could discuss that the whole day. Avoiding one long-distance flight. The big things, they don't appear high up in the opinion polls. So people think that small things make a big difference and think that big things are not so important. If I can just summarize this slightly frustrating statistics. Other questions about this year?
What about using digital devices? And I think now it's getting quite it starts to be quite a topic about digital services and to store our data using Netflix and TikTok and so on. And the use are quite increasing, and then we need energy for this. And it is.
Yeah. I think I don't have statistics about that, but you can see clearly that the growth rates are massive. What it means in absolute terms, I don't know. It also depends very much on the context you're in. If you're in Norway, where all electricity comes from hydropower, it's not such a big deal. If you're in Slovenia, where a third comes from fish, it's a bigger deal. So same for, actually we did in Lund with some, now that I saw that you were fixing things here in the workshop, some studies on in which context does it make sense to actually put in place legislation to prolong the lifetime of devices. Because sometimes it's good that you change device because you get a more efficient one. And in dirty electricity grids, that makes sense. Please get a more efficient one quickly. In Norway, it almost never makes sense. You should prolong the lifetime of products as much as you can. You shouldn't switch to an LED, but you should have your žarnica. But there's now incandescent light bulb. Incandescent light bulb. So yes, but this is too big of an excursion now. I don't have the figures. Sorry. Yes. So also when we campaign for behavioral change, we try to always highlight in our messaging, changing your light bulbs is not so important. Switching off devices from standby is not so important. Hang dry your clothes or washing them at 40 degrees instead of 60 degrees is not so important. Flying on holiday to the other part of the world across the ocean can have a massive environmental footprint. So one long distance return flight to Australia basically causes more emissions in CO2 equivalent than I think more than half of the world's average, no, half of the world has average per capita emissions that are lower than one return flight per year. So with one flight you're actually emitting more than vast amounts of people around this planet. By the way, on average, from now until 2050, what is considered the average sustainable footprint is around 1.7 tons per year. This is somewhere here. So just your car actually uses that up with one flight, your one return flight across the ocean, you're way above that. That of course means that in the years to come we can have a much higher footprint, but then in 2050 we have to be at zero. But it's the average for this period from now until 2050. Yeah, there was questions.
I have a question. So the first one is one flight that we must say, but life without the car, is that like for a lifetime?
No, it's
a
1 year.
year.
It's per year.
Okay.
Leert niet gaan.
Ah, sorry.
No, you cannot see it, it's so small. I will share the slides anyways.
Ampak to eno vprašanje, Jonas.
Ja.
Avtohiša, ne? Sej v resnici, če ti pokuraš 3000 litrov olja na let, ne, konvencionalna hiša, to je približno toliko, kot porabiš nafte, če imaš enega dizla, ne?
Ja.
Zakaj je bila taka razlika?
Yeah. Because not everybody is heating the house with oil.
Yeah, okay.
This is average figures. So if you have a small apartment in a block and you get it from
Ja, ok. Dobro, tudi avtor ni vsak misli. Ampak vsem se mi zdi malo velika razlika med tako, ne?
We can discuss that maybe later on. My point here was a different name, more in the context of communication, focus on what is really actually. Now I'm also carried away. Sorry for that. Because we are limited in time, I just want to continue and talk a little bit about the context of communication. Because the context will change the messages you have, it will change the medium that you will use, it will change a lot in your communication. And you can think about many different contexts. I've just come up with a small list here and I don't want to go through it, but just give you some examples. The context where, for me, in my personal work, communication matters most is politics, communicating with policymakers. There's also a very good paper, scientific paper, how to communicate effectively with policymakers, combining insights from psychology and policy studies. So maybe this is for some of you also a relevant paper. I think here is a little bit what we did in the beginning. Who is the receiver? Understand your audience. Do not bombard policymakers with evidence. We send a lot of letters, campaign letters, petitions to policymakers, and just 2 days ago we got sent one from European Environmental Organization to forward it to the Ministry of Environment, and it was 3.5 pages, and very detailed information. I was just shaking my head, because here we shape the message from the perspective of the sender, right? We think about us as what we think is important, and it's a lot, right? But we should probably think about who is our audience and what kind of very much synthesized information do they need. So understand the receiver. And be super pragmatic. This whole paper is basically about being pragmatic. Identify the right time to exploit windows of opportunities. It's not always the right moment to contact people. And sometimes a very good message will not be heard because it's not the right moment. If there's another scandal going on at the policy level, and now it's very hard time to actually get in between all the scandals, but then there's no point in putting out some very specific environmental communication.
And it's not always the right person who gives the message.
Yes. Yes.
It matters who says, not only what.
Actually, this is maybe a good point to add, which is not so much highlighted in this paper. I totally agree. I'm very often invited by media to give statements because I have a PhD and I'm a foreigner. And it's not because I'm so smart.
From Germany, that's also important that you're from Germany, because when my grandma reads about Jonas, he's from Germany.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. He's from Germany.
And to be perfectly blunt, I don't think it's always justified from a content perspective.
Lahko sam eno zgodbo, ker je zelo v kontekstu. Pa ker je ravno gospa iz občine Kranjska Gora tukaj. Še let nazaj smo imeli na Cipri en projekt, ki se je imenoval Klimat. In smo delali promocijo za trajnostno obnovo stavb, hoteli, že javna infrastruktura. In ko smo delali to reklamo po Kranjski Gori, nekako nismo prišli skozi. Nismo uspeli, da bi tam malo jim to predstavili, pa da bi šli oni nek projekt. In ni minilo 5-6 let, ko so prenovili hotel Prisluhnite, in so nas povabili in se je župan pohvalil, da so ga energetsko prenovili. Ko sem jaz vprašal, pa zakaj pa 5-6 let nazaj niste šli v to zgodbo, ki smo mi predstavljali, pa rekel, veš, v Kranjski Gori moraš po angleško povedati, da te zastopijo. Če pa po slovensko veš, ni bom ne verjeti. Ampak, to je to.
I also have a couple of examples. Last point is that actually engage in the process through the channels for communication that are actually used in policy making, rather than waiting for the right, correct policy making process. I'll give an example in a second. Windows of opportunity. So from my experience, after the global financial crisis, 2009, there were years where countries had to save. There were austerity measures in place. So Slovenia had to cut down spending, find new ways to generate state revenue, just like Greece and other countries. Banking crisis, Miller had to get bailed out, and so on. In this context, publishing a report on phasing out environmentally harmful subsidies and maybe generating more through environmental taxation was a very good moment. Right? If we were now talking about introducing additional fuel taxes or something, very bad moment, right? Because energy prices are so high. What I'm saying is, in this window of opportunity, we had the right message. It was good timing. Because there was a need for the kind of solutions we suggested anyways. Around New Year's and then there was the bankruptcy of Adria Airways. We launched a campaign on Leto bez leta, also very good timing, because during New Year's you make your New Year's resolutions, you want to sign pledges. There was anyways talk about throwing money into the sector, so we could basically connect it to some political messages too. It was very good timing. Sometimes you have to be lucky. No? Sometimes you have to have the right messages in the right time, and here I think this is a case where we're also a little bit lucky. Orderly process. Well, I think this summer is a good example. The referendum on the Water Act. You probably have all heard about that. The orderly process for getting involved in policy making here would be to have a public participation process before a new law or new zakon is put in place. But in the case of the Water Act, there was an accelerated process with extremely limited or basically no public participation. So if we would wait for communicating through the orderly process, we would not be heard, right? So I think that's a success story. And then, of course, the whole civil society sector kind of joined forces and ran a campaign to get a referendum and then to win the referendum, and then the referendum was won. Again, also a good window of opportunity, because I think public opinion was anyways against the government. So having something, a referendum against a law that was proposed by the government was of course a very good moment in time. But you see what I mean? Communication has to be well timed and has to be sometimes outside the foreseen communication channels when you talk about policy making. And now the medium. I think here is a very nice example from Banksy, where the medium and the message actually, where the medium already is the message in a way. Right? It's a writing on a wall. I don't believe in global warming, and that's a wall that is flooded. So, good choice of medium for that message, I would say. Now, when we're talking about media, there's endless forms of media for climate communication. And I just want to maybe show a couple of examples outside the box. Now it's late afternoon. I was at the theater a couple of days ago, Vorčina by Žiga Divjak in Mladinske Jelenište. And I think in the end, what they did is to say it now maybe extremely, give a PowerPoint presentation. Right? The whole text of this play was basically a lecture. There were tons of data. Starting off from in 1992, the emissions were so far. The first UNFCCC conference took place. Now 30 years later. But it was, of course, communicated in a completely different way. They were shouting at us. The guy up here, he's the activist who tried to repeat, we have to escalate, we have to escalate. So they put him the tape across the mouth. And he was basically rubbing on the ground towards the audience so we could remove it again from his mouth. So what they said, the lyrics or the text was not very extreme, but through the medium, through how it was communicated, it suddenly became quite extreme. Much more depressing than my initial presentation, unfortunately. And it was a lot about the psychological aspects and climate anxiety as well. We have an exhibition on the hot side of the Alps, so many pictures are taken from that, also online, which is another medium to maybe communicate some of the messages we have. Also, we are learning a lot when it comes to media. I think it's very good when we talk about impacts, the exhibition. Then there's a part that is on the other side of the backside, how to activate, how to get into how to get active, how to become an active citizen. There's almost only text. So I think there's still room for improvement, but yeah, we're in a big learning process as well. Now we have also in the Care for Climate project TV advertisements. This is the last one. Yeah, from last year, basically.
Samo en planet imamo, skrajni čas je, da se nehamo igrati z njim. Spremenimo navade in poskrbimo za naš planet. Skupaj nam bo uspelo.
You see how basically adding to the picture, music and some movement can maybe create some emotional reaction. I think here is a very crucial question, and also what is the message? And I think here we had a little bit of discussions also within the project. Once you kind of get hooked, what is the next step? Then when you go to the website and see somewhere in Planet, what should be the messaging be? I think these kind of very short advertisements and films are very good to hook somebody, but then if we actually want to activate people to change behavior, then we have to give them a little bit more than that. And then I think the website in this case is very important, and I think here I shared my opinion with you when it comes to simple painless campaigning and small changes, but you can combine, that's what I wanted to say, that's why I took it here. You can kind of combine this kind of emotional hook with then in the next step some more complex messaging. Some media are really not good for complex messages. TV advertisements are not good for complex messages, you have some seconds. Yeah, actually a form of communication is also activism or civil disobedience. It's one way you actually get your message into the news. This is from Berlin. It's actually a positive action because Greenpeace was pouring yellow biodegradable color on one of the big roundabouts, and if you look at it from space, well not from space but from high in the air, it looks like a sun. So they took that as a hook as well to then roll out their campaign on promoting solar energy instead of coal. This backfired a little bit because people got very angry and they got sued and I don't know what, but Germans, when it's about their cars, they don't understand fun. I can yeah, and of course you can mix media. So in the beginning I had the presentation that was very factual, many graphs. This is an example where maybe you can then combine video with a graph. I like it a lot because it shows the Arctic sea ice minimum every year and how it changes over time. Because probably just a graph is sometimes quite abstract, while seeing the ice disappear over time is maybe helping understand how serious the situation is. Yep. Back to doomsday messages. Another one is about the carbon budget. So basically, how much we can still emit. This is also quite frustrating. So how much do we have left until 1.5 degrees, and who has emitted in the past? And you see the bucket is filling, the bucket is filling, the bucket is filling. Yeah. And we're almost there. Well, I mean, you get the message. You can probably frame graphs also in different ways and use different media. Okay. We are almost 6 o'clock, so I want to kind of wrap up a little bit some of the things that we have talked about. So here's a summary of somebody who looked at it much more systematically than me. Again, a scientific article, also very worthwhile reading if you're into climate change communication. To overcome barriers to public engagement in climate change, so behavior change, what we're after, the climate change communication literature points to the potential of enabling positive feedback on individual actions, focusing on solutions. So here is again what I said before, being positive, not just doomsday, but always at the end, after the doomsday messaging, also say, hey, come on board, this is what we can do. This is what you're doing already quite well, do more of it. This is the positive feedback on individual actions. Rather than a catastrophic consequence of climate change, making complex science-based messages on climate change tangible and more concrete. So if you look at even the summary for policymakers of the IPCC report, it is still 70 pages and it's still very factual. So I think with different media, images, metaphors, computer animations and so on, it's maybe a bit easier then to grab very complex messages more easily. Of course, you're simplifying. When you probably had the presentation about the climate science, it's not always one line, but there's likelihoods, there is risks and so on. It could be much worse, it could be much better. This you cut all out when you do simplified communication. Yes. And then the last one is taking the interpretive frames and previous understandings of different audiences into account. So we have to understand the receiver of the message. Rethink how the issue of climate change is framed to resonate with different publics. So just, yes, message, medium, and receiver are something we should think about when we shape as the sender our communication here. Lots of input. I talked way too much. It should have been much more like a workshop, but I thought in 1.5 hours I cannot cover it all. Sorry. Before giving you some take-home messages, I think I want to also highlight some of the challenges. I think, yes, knowledge about climate change is rising, but it's still very superficial. I think hardly anybody can explain to you the greenhouse effect and how it works. Hardly anybody can tell you what are actually the implications until the end of the century. What are the risks? Because we're very often talking about risks that are not even mentioned, right? When we look at scenarios, it looks very nice like a line, but the scenario also means that there's a risk it could be much worse if there are feedback mechanisms, tipping points, and so on. So the understanding is still rather superficial. I think, yes, transitioning away from awareness, concern, values to actual action, to focusing how, this is still a big research area, how to actually frame a message, compose a message that it leads to action, not just to awareness, increased awareness. Yes, increasingly we are communicating in a very politicized and polarized environment. I think very often environmental issues, climate change issues are associated with a certain part of the policy process or a certain group. Facts don't play such a big role anymore, but on which side you are is much, much more important. And I think the last point, actually, I was quite, without an answer. I was lecturing last week at the economics faculty, and then at the end one student asked me, but so how can we deal with this? How can we not get overwhelmed or hopeless? And I think this is also very important in the communication, which is, for me personally, very difficult to communicate this growing sense or a growing sense of optimism, actually. I'm a very optimistic person, but in this context, it's very hard to find the right framing of my messages, I think, to also appear like a sound scientist and be optimistic. So combining that, I still have challenges. Now, what should you take home from this presentation? I think we all know we cannot remember more than 3 things, at least I cannot, so there are 3 take-home messages. Another golden rule for communication, never give more than 3 take-home messages maximum. Yes, be aware that in climate communication we can take, but also address, and especially address several different roles. Climate communication doesn't address us as an individual consumer, but also as a citizen, as somebody working in an organization, as somebody living in a social environment, as a potential role model. So we have all these different roles. We're not just consumers, luckily. Yes, messages should be well timed, and especially we should prioritize important drivers, important impacts, important measures, important solutions. So not everything is equally important. And I think this is very important when we shape our messages. Don't put a message about a solution that is really tiny front and center, where we have maybe other solutions that are much more relevant for solving the climate crisis. Yes, and the medium matters and should fit the context. Sometimes maybe, with this I don't mean that if you're in a scientific context you should only show graphs. If you're in a theater context you should only use prose and nice words. No, I think actually using media actively to disrupt, to make people surprised is also a very good strategy. I was super surprised when I went to the theater because I didn't expect at all a lecture, which I got in the end. But because the lecture was combined with such an awkward medium in this way, in this case, it actually stuck with me. So I will not forget the guy screaming at me, "We have to escalate," at least 10 times. So, yes, this is my input. And I'm happy to take the 5 minutes to either have discussions in the whole group if there are any questions, or to maybe stay here a little bit longer and have bilateral conversations about the topic. Yeah? Yeah, there's a question.
What's your opinion on Slovenia or on Europe about are companies actually making changes? Are they really sustainable? Are they just doing the greenwashing? Do you understand me?
Yeah. It's a very big and difficult question. I think there are several sectors where Slovenia is really behind. So you cannot give a general answer to.
Okay, for example?
I mean, when it comes to renewable electricity, it's quite frustrating when you talk about solar or wind or whatever, where even the uncontroversial potential, let's say putting solar panels on roofs, is not very far developed. There are other aspects where maybe also this generally very negative sentiment is caused by Slovenians being very critical. I think also self-critical, which in a way is good to drive progress, but then sometimes you get the impression that everything is bad. I think if you look at Germany and the transport sector, we're facing the same challenges, how to get away from the internal combustion engine car as the main means of transport. But it's too big of a question to answer now in 2 minutes. I would have to think about that much longer. But yeah, we had the same discussion with the journalists. So what can we do until 2030? Right? What can actually be done, and what is not realistic to be done? And yeah, there are some things like like rolling out electric vehicles, setting a clear timeline for phasing them out, the internal combustion engine. I think sometimes also just being a bit more daring, not following the EU, what the EU says, but basically actively having an own agenda. This is something that is really missing in Slovenia. I think also for industry, there were many studies in the context of renewable electricity and also energy efficiency, where industry said, if we have a clear policy guideline, we can adapt quite quickly. So a regulation that says phasing out the internal combustion engine in 10 years is very easy to handle in a way, because it's very clear cut. Saying we will increase the prices and then the price will fluctuate, we don't really know, doesn't give an investor the safety to invest. Now I'm in my favorite topic, climate policy, but so there were several studies saying that actually industry sometimes favors regulation. The energy, the eco-design directive at the European level is a very good example. This is the directive that actually phased out the žarnica. And there were huge debates about it, that it cannot be done, it's way too quick, it will be freaking expensive to buy LEDs. But there was a clear timeline when first the LEDs, then first the 100 watts lamp was not allowed, then the 60 watts. There was a clear schedule, and now nobody even thinks about it anymore. It's really not a big issue, because it was a regulation that was well in advance planned. And so having this kind of mid-term agenda very clearly communicated with clear guidelines and regulation, this is something that I think is sometimes lacking in Slovenia, where it's much more reactive approach. Again, now with the Fit for 55 package that Barbara talked about, now many countries are just waiting. We're waiting to see what this package will actually mean. Many of the files under this package will be negotiated now for 2 to 3 years, then will transfer to national legislation. This will take another year. So this is a very slow, reactive approach. Here I would wish a much more proactive agenda-setting approach. Now this was a big diversion from the question, but I hope it was a useful answer anyways. Yeah?
Are you optimistic about this whole thing, or?
You mean the climate crisis? I'm very optimistic for my own life. I'm very pessimistic that we can actually, until the end of the century, achieve the targets that we have set, even closely. So I think we live in a region of the world that will not be hit as quickly as hard. So for my personal life, I'm not pessimistic, but overall, I think very often, and that also goes for proposed solutions. We look at a problem from an engineering perspective or from a climate science perspective. And all these models, you can model them in a way that we reach 1.5 or 2 degrees, right? But the 1.5 degree models, they all depend on massive negative emission technologies that are science fiction. Even if we implement them, they require biofuels to be grown on an area of India only for energy purposes. No, this will never happen. Okay? So from an engineering perspective, from a modeling perspective, we can make it. But if we put social science into the equation, how change is happening, change processes and so on, then I'm getting pessimistic. Similar debate we have now in Slovenia about nuclear power as the one solution. I'm not afraid of nuclear power that it will impact my health. To be perfectly honest, this is not many people are. I'm not too afraid. Coal has killed hundreds and thousands of more people. However, I don't think there will ever be a second nuclear power plant in Slovenia, because this is not only an engineering problem. From an engineering perspective, you can build it. Somebody can build it. But it's a political problem. You have to convince neighboring countries. It's an economic problem. Within the legislative framework of Slovenia, you have to basically survive a referendum. Then you can sue the government, which is already taking place because the environmental impact assessment is not correct. This will be an endless process. But not from an engineering perspective, but if you put into the equation all the other perspectives. So I think that's why I'm sometimes a bit pessimistic.
I think we have a very good example Skratka, to, kar se nam s podnebjem dogaja na daljši časovni skali in to, kar se zdaj zelo lepo povzel, se vidi v, kako obravnavamo tole nesrečno pandemijo. Znanost in zdravstvo vesta vse, ampak mi gremo pa točno, kje kamor pač gremo. Vsak po svoje, pa vsi kamor. In zelo podoben je...
Slovenija.
No, pa tudi svet se še ni čisto. Ok, mogoče Slovenija še bolj.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very hard to handle complexity in general, in big...
Focus on.
This was a clear sign. No, it was a lot of fun, so I hope you will enjoy also the last day. And unfortunately I cannot make it to the dinner because I have more work. I have to go to the second and get our exhibition back.
But maybe for optimistic conclusion, ne? Če ne spravimo na 2,7, spravimo pa na 7,2.